Hey, Lego, you can't go out there and make a video like this. You can't just be salty that the Montreal Canadiens did not take Shane Wright first overall, the 2022 NHL Entry Draft. Now, before we get into that, by the way, that's just not really what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of talking about what other people are talking about, which is pretty much like 90% of this YouTube channel anyway. So, calm down. Take your fingers off the keyboard and listen to what I have to say here before getting into it in the comments. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Montreal Canadiens and their Prospect Challenge Showcase that was held in Buffalo just the other day. We had ourselves 3 games for Montreal. It's apparent to me that it's now concluded and the entire tournament is said and done. And when it comes to the big discourse that people are taking away from Montreal Canadiens prospects because of this tournament, the biggest one that I have seen is that first overall pick Juraj Slafkovsky maybe could have gone out there and had himself a better tournament. Now, this is the big one, because if you go over and search his name anywhere on Twitter, you'll see more than one conversation going on about whether or not it was actually impressive for the Canadiens, and whether or not this is just a little bit of a slower start, because hey, he needs to get used to North American ice and NHL systems, etc. But at the end of the day, Slafkovsky did not really go out there and produce all too many points. However, there were a few things that he did right that I actually did go out there and acknowledge in a video a few days ago. Despite this, though, there were some other players for the Montreal Canadiens in their prospect system that showed off much better, and who actually defied the expectations, putting themselves in a status of the team's fanbase that says that they could be among one of the fan-favorite prospects as early on as the start of this 22-23 year. Today, we're talking about a guy in the Montreal Canadiens system who played the 3 games for the Canadiens Prospect Summer Showcase and who is being dubbed by some NHL scouts as a discount Shane Wright. Let's go over the Montreal Canadiens second-round pick in the 2022 draft, Owen Beck. Now, Beck was taken 33rd overall. As we said, it was a second-round pick, the first pick by the Montreal Canadiens in round number 2. Beck is 18 years old, 5'11", 190 pounds, is a right-handed center, and he's a guy that went out there and absolutely showcased the best version of himself possible in this little prospect showcase. Now, there already was a good amount of hype for Beck in the previous few months that we had had prospect talks. He had 51 points in 68 games played with the Mississauga Steelheads last season in the OHL, and he had 6 points in 10 games in the playoffs. But when it came to the way Owen Beck performed out there on the ice, there was a very specified toolkit that he had that made a lot of scouts' mouths water when it came to watching him on the ice. This is the Elite Prospect Scouting Report on Owen Beck. He's a powerful skater with a good mix of crossovers, and he gets to his top speed quickly. He uses that speed to back defenders up and even rush right past them on some sequences. Beck uses that speed to provide constant support at every corner of the ice. He is the ultimate play connector, always offering his teammates a passing option and showing a great knack for linking defense to offense. Owen Beck is a very capable, all-situations kind of guy that we had seen in games 1, 2, and 3 for Montreal in this prospect showcase as being just an absolute bulldog. In the first game against Buffalo, there was a goal that he scored where he split the D and he absolutely roofed it top shelf. On the forehand as well, short side on the goaltender. The second game against the New Jersey Devils, you saw Owen Beck all over the ice, back-checking like crazy, just making the right plays, making the right reads, and doing some pretty impressive things, like batting the puck out of midair on the back check, for example, while the Devils are trying to go out there and make a play. The second goal he scored in the tournament was a pretty nice one. He was like falling down while taking the shot, which put him back up on the board there too. Beck and Kidney actually had some pretty good chemistry, building off of each other and setting each other up for plays. Beck was the trigger man on some of these instances in the game against New Jersey. And there was so much good out of Owen Beck over the past 3 days worth of prospect games that if we go over onto Twitter and we see what some of the NHL scouts are going out there and saying about this guy, it gets a little bit nutty, and I love it. So let's go over onto Jared Book. First and foremost, he is the deputy managing editor at Habs Eye on the Prize. This is what he said 3 days ago, something like that. 4 days ago, excuse me. Talking about Owen Beck, I called Owen Beck Shane Wright Light, and I might have been underselling him. This is what Hattie went out there and said, also a writer for Habs Eye on the Prize and a scout for Dobber Prospects. They said this one game into my Owen Beck scouting report back in July, and I can say this. He's a poor man's Shane Wright. I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out. Owen Beck is highly intelligent, he's exceptional in transition, connecting defense to wingers effortlessly, and he has a decent defensive game with projectable habits. That's just straight-up Shane Wright without the booming shot. You then have Aaron Itovich, who works for Dobber Prospects as well, reflecting on some of the prospects in the tournaments. This is what he said about Owen Beck. I loved Beck going into the draft. I loved him enough to have him go 19th on my board, and enough to steal him at 30th overall in my fantasy league draft. He has been overhyped quite a bit this weekend, by myself included, but for good reason. He's a good skater, and he's incredibly smart. He needs to work on the physical part of the two-way center game, but I wholeheartedly believe he could be a third-line center in the NHL right now. He oozes high floor, and I can't wait to see him obliterate the competition in Mississauga next year. And so that's pretty high praise coming from the Texas writer for Dobber Prospects, going out there and saying that Owen Beck could be as good as being a third-line center now, at 18 years old, after just one season's worth of OHL play. And you gotta remember, for Owen Beck, I mean, the draft minus one season that he had in the OHL, it was non-existent. He had 0 games played in 2020-2021 because the OHL didn't happen. And so this really is just such an interesting player that is so good at what he does that the idea of calling him a Shane Wright clone, a discount Shane Wright, a poor man Shane Wright light, I guess you could say, there are some minds in the hockey scouting community that would not say that that label is inaccurate. And this prospect tournament pretty much went out there and shoved him into the faces of every Canadiens fan going out there and watching the YouTube live streams and seeing what the other 20,000 Canadiens fans were witnessing in front of their faces, and Owen Beck making some good plays with Riley Kidney, and Juraj Slafkovsky really not being as good or as dominant as some people wanted him to be, but that might be okay because, hey, small sample size, right? But then again, wait a minute, Owen Beck, you're calling this guy discount Shane Wright off of a small sample size? I mean, Shane Wright is a guy who, to me, is not Connor McDavid. He is not Austin Matthews. He will not go out there and absolutely dominate shifts with his skating or just absolutely pull a shot out of nowhere. He's a guy that makes very cerebral, smart plays. He doesn't really look like he's got the best work ethic out there, but that's because he doesn't need to always have that in order to be an effective player. He can just stay in the offensive zone, lurk around for a few seconds, wait a little bit, not really move a little bit, and then bam, when he sees an opening, he takes the puck, he steals it from the guy in front of him, walks in with a shot, he snipes it, and scores. Hattie's tweet, if we review what Hattie said, I mean, this tweet is back from July. And that's when they started doing their Owen Beck scouting, so there is a little bit of an idea that's been floating around that this player could be this good, and it's been going around for a while. Now, that doesn't mean that Owen Beck is going to be a franchise-caliber prospect like Shane Wright is. I mean, Shane Wright light. Maybe just say the guy's going to be a top 6 forward at best, maybe a third-line center at worst. I don't know, maybe a fourth-line center, a guy that makes the league in general at worst. And I mean, at 33rd overall, that's definitely not a bad pickup. There are so many second rounders that don't even make the NHL, let alone second rounders that are not that good. So if this guy can actually come in here and perform to a standard that has a lot of Canadiens fans saying, wow, that guy plays like a discount Shane Wright, I think that's a pretty good pickup for a guy in the second round, and somebody that could play somewhere in your third line if everything works out properly in the next few years. So, talk to the comments on your thoughts about Owen Beck, what you had noticed over the past 3 games worth of Canadiens prospect hockey, and whether or not you can see why people are calling him somewhat of a discount Shane Wright. Owen Beck, if he could do something like that, then hey, be my guest, eh? Talk to the comments on your thoughts about this idea. I hope you enjoyed this video. Rolls 99, and bye.